is Luke Barbagello, and I'd like to welcome you to this EWB webinar, where we will be contemplating 3 degrees with our special guests, Dr. Helen Redman and David Hood AM. Before continuing, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I am zooming in from today, the Gumbaynggirr peoples. I recognise their long history on this land and the care that they have given to it over the tens of thousands of years that they've been here. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present of this land and extend those respects to the elders past and present of the lands from which you are all zooming in from. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to acknowledge that today is International Women in Engineering Day, and on behalf of EWB, I'd like to reaffirm our commitment to supporting an increase in women's participation, achievement and leadership within the engineering sector. So moving on to today's event. Today's event came about in response to recent reports from the UN that the current policies and commitments by the world's government and corporate emitters that the planet is on track for a 3-degree global temperature rise by the end of the century. So what does a 3-degree future mean for ourselves, our families, our communities, our infrastructure, our social and political systems? What does it mean for engineers and the technical sectors that are the facilitators of our current carbon-intensive systems and who will also be the facilitators of a just and equitable transition towards a safer and more sustainable future? Our 2 speakers today will be responding to the following question: how do you envision a world that has faced a 3-degree rise in global temperatures by 2100? After our speakers have shared their visions on that question, we will be breaking into a short Q&A followed by an interactive workshop, which I'll share more information about when we reach that section of the call. So introducing our 2 speakers. Our first speaker, Dr. Helen Redman, is a rehabilitation medicine physician who is joining us from the Gadigal and Wangal lands of the Eora Nation. Dr. Redman is a strong advocate for the protection of our health through the protection of our environment, and has spent over 11 years raising awareness of the health impacts of fossil fuels and climate change to community and professional audiences. She is a volunteer with the public health advocacy group Doctors of the Environment, and I encourage you all to seek out and watch her TEDx presentation titled "Should You Talk to Your Doctor About Climate Change?" She will be responding to the question from the perspective of a pessimist. Helen, welcome. Our other speaker, David Hood AM, will respond to the question from the perspective of an optimist. Joining us from Envision country, home of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, Mr. Hood is a civil and environmental engineer whose career and experiences ranges across major civil and military projects, senior management in the public and private sectors, and in recent years, academia. He is the inaugural Beyond Zero Emissions Fellow and previously served on the board of directors of that organisation. He is also a Queensland councillor and board director of the Australian Conservation Foundation and has previously served as the national president of Engineering Australia. David is a passionate and outspoken advocate for the planet and all of its residents. So I will now invite Helen to share her screen and share her vision for a world at 2100 and at 3 degrees of warming. Helen, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luke. And great to have everybody here. I'm going to just warn you that I've not done one of these on a Zoom before, so I've always been in front of an actual audience. So if there's any little technical things, then that might explain it. The references I've used to prepare this talk will be available from Luke. But in particular, I'd just like to mention this particular book here, which is a wonderful resource and is very well researched and referenced. And I highly recommend it if you're interested in actually just seeing what different degrees will actually lead us to. And this formed a very good portion of my talk. So just to acknowledge that at the beginning. So I'm going to paint you a picture of the world we'll be living in if global heating increases past our Paris target of 1.5 degrees to one where the average temperatures are 3 degrees or warmer. It's a world where, hang on a minute. There we go. It's a world we're currently on a trajectory to reach because the total emission reductions that we currently pledged through the 2015 Paris Agreement, even if they're implemented on time, will translate to a temperature rise of 3 degrees or more by 2100. And you can see this as the orange line through the centre of this little graph here. So like my favourite book, The Lorax, says, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. We know with great clarity, in fact, what 3 degrees will mean for Earth systems. So I'm a doctor and we constantly work with uncertainty and incomplete information when we're prescribing life-saving or even life-threatening treatments to patients. And the certainty with which we understand the consequences of continuing to increase CO2 in the atmosphere is almost unheard of, actually, in my profession. It's also true that nothing humanity has done about climate change so far has changed the relentless rise of CO2. Unless and until CO2 concentrations stabilise and then decrease, we haven't really even begun the fight against climate change. So the pessimistic view with which I've been charged with is simply a recitation of the science of global heating. And because I'm a doctor, I've used the health frame. It's how I'm used to talking about these things. Human health is determined by many factors, of course. And if you look at this diagram, in the centre, there are the most personal factors, from our genetics, lifestyle, our occupation, through to broader things like social and economic factors, to the most overarching factors in the environment and biosphere. And climate is the major environmental determinant of health. And climate heating adversely affects all the other environmental determinants of health, such as air, water, food, and ecosystems. So the pathways that they impact human health are listed in this very handy little diagram. And for example, Australia's Black Summer, we lost 34 lives directly to the fires, but 445 lives were lost through smoke inhalation, as the smoke from the fires blanketed large areas and cities in Eastern Australia. And that was due to air quality changes. So 3 degrees is actually hotter than the human species has ever experienced. You have to go back to the Pliocene 3 million years ago to find a world that is 3 degrees hotter than now. Back then, there were diverse forests 2,000 kilometres north of the current tree line in the Arctic. The Arctic was seasonally ice-free, and the West Antarctic ice sheet just wasn't even there. Dwarf beech forests actually grew 480 kilometres from the South Pole. Sea level was up to 14 metres higher, and CO2 was about 400 parts per million. And you probably know that today we're already at 419 parts per million. So we're going to be back in the Pliocene as early as 2030 if the current emission trends actually continue. Sorry. Okay, so just before we go on to explain a bit more about that, I just want to remind you that those who contributed the least to the problem will actually be the worst affected. So that's who's emitted, and this is who's going to be affected the worst by climate change. I'm sure you've probably seen those graphs before. With sea level rise, already warming oceans are undercutting the West Antarctic ice sheet, and total collapse is going to follow eventually in a 3 degree world. The much larger East Antarctic ice sheet will also begin to decline, and up to 50% of the Greenland ice will also melt. So multi-metre sea level rises will take centuries to play out, but by 2100, at 3 degrees, we've got a 50% chance of having a 1 metre sea level rise and 5% chance of a nearly 2 metre sea level rise. So if we assume the best and say we're going to have 0.5 metre sea level rise by 2100, that inundates land where 50 million people are currently living. So the worst case is hundreds of millions of people displaced by sea level rise. And it's not gradual. Areas can become suddenly uninhabitable due to storm surges, coastal erosion, inundation of freshwater supplies with seawater, and land salination. By 2100, sea level will be rising faster than at any other time during human civilization. 2,500 square kilometres of Bangladesh will be flooded at 3 degrees, and much more will be at risk of flooding from cyclones and monsoon floods. The escalating damage costs will result in coastal areas and whole cities actually being abandoned. Irreplaceable natural and cultural heritage will also be lost. For example, Carthage, Venice, the Tower of London, and the Sydney Opera House. Heat. In June 2019, Delhi reached 48 degrees and it was 51 in Pakistan. That particular heat wave killed 3,500 people. But in a 3-degree world, that'll actually be considered a cool summer. So we have a physiology and we have certain tolerances and intolerances to heat. So once you have a wet bulb temperature of more than 35 degrees, our human sweat response, which is essential for our cooling, becomes ineffective and our core temperature starts to rise. When nights are too hot, our bodies don't cool down, and many heat-related deaths actually occur at night. Heat's called the silent killer because heat waves kill more Australians than any other natural disaster already. And they're vastly underreported, possibly by a factor of up to 50. They're not written, heat is not written down on death certificates. The doctors will write renal failure, dehydration, fall and head injury, heart attack, stroke, respiratory failure. All these things can be caused by a heat wave in a vulnerable population. And it's the elderly and it's those with chronic illness, the very young, people who work outdoors, and people in remote and disadvantaged communities that are disproportionately affected by heat illness and death. So here's a paper from 2016, which just documents the rise in heat-related deaths in our capital cities in Australia. In Australia, the annual likelihood of a major heat wave will rise from 1.7% in 2010 to 78%. Heat waves will be hotter, longer, and more frequent. For example, in Queensland, they will increase from events lasting about a week, occurring 3 times a year, at warming of less than 1.5 degrees, to events that last 16 days and occur 7 times a year. And this has major implications for workability and survivability of large areas of Australia. So 30% of the global population is already exposed to more than 20 deadly heat days per year. And I'm not sure whether you can see the detail on this graph, which is from this paper from the Lancet Planetary Health. But the top graph is recent past. The second is 1.5, the third is 2 degrees, and the bottom graph is 3 degrees, which is what we're looking at. And red is high risk and yellow is extreme risk of areas becoming basically uninhabitable. And you can see from that bottom graph that a lot of Australia is red and some is also yellow. So in 3 degrees, basically half the global population is going to be exposed. Whole countries are not going to be survivable or habitable, and there's going to be mass migration of millions as a result. Moving on to the consequences of heat, which are desertification and fire. Back to the example of our black summer. It's a bit of a foretaste of what's to come. We had prolonged drought for many years, and then that was followed by mega fires. More than 20% of our terrestrial forests burned in that year, and normally in an average year it's less than 2%. So with, you know, massive loss of animal life as well, 3 billion animals, I think. So in 3 degrees, it's forecast that annual burned areas globally are going to be increased by 187%. And there's also drastic declines in rainfall. If you look at this graph here, you've got baseline 1.5, 2 degrees and 3 degrees. The grey areas are where there's no sort of reliable data, but you go from these colour codes, which means sort of less drought than expected is blue, and much higher risk of drought is red. And you can see how the whole Mediterranean area becomes red. So if we just look at that region, basically Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya and Egypt lose virtually all their rainfall. Most of Spain and Portugal become desert. So do the south of France, most of Italy, all of Greece and most of Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine and Israel. So to maintain current populations in those very populous countries, there's going to be massive desalination of seawater to meet needs. All crops are going to be irrigated, and basically rain-fed farming will cease to exist. You can see what happens to Australia in this progression of drought as well. We go from a sort of a multi-hued country up here to one that looks a bit wetter, and then actually becomes at 3 degrees extremely drought struck constantly. So arid areas cover half the global land mass in a 3-degree world, with developing countries most affected. But also Australia, we're a very climate vulnerable nation, as I'm sure you know. So back to icy things. 3 degrees will see most of today's glacier volume melting. Damage to precious natural habitats and heritage is going to follow that. But water flows from ice melt will dwindle, and this leaves downstream areas parched and cities without sufficient water, affecting hydropower and agriculture and croplands. Also on the water side of things, heat energy speeds up the Earth's hydrological cycle, leading to more severe flooding events. And although rainfall overall diminishes, it becomes in more intense bursts and floods, meaning it's less reliable for growing food or replenishing groundwater. 200 million people will be affected by river flooding every year at 3 degrees, and flood mortality is going to quadruple to 20,000 people per year. Areas affected are going to include India, Bangladesh, the UK, Ireland, Egypt, Ecuador, Scandinavia, the US. And it also includes all those areas that haven't been already adversely affected by drought and heat waves. So the current trend to build more and more houses closer to rivers is going to have to reverse, because they're going to become stranded assets very quickly. Biodiversity and ecosystems. So we're going to look at the loss of half of plants, insects, amphibians, and over a third of birds, reptiles, and mammals. They're going to lose more than half their range in a 3-degree world by 2100. Trees and primates, unfortunately, are first in the firing line. Species will be pushed up hills and eventually off the top of mountains, and climatic zones will move just too fast for species to adapt. Collapse of ecosystems and fisheries will follow, and treasured places of natural beauty and biodiversity are going to be lost. The coral reefs, as we know, are going to be lost at 2 degrees. At 3 degrees, we're going to lose the rest of the ancient Gondwana forests, like those that were destroyed by the drought and fires in Tasmania in 2016. We're also going to lose the Amazon rainforest, which, after decades of insufficient rain, repeated fire, relentless clearing for grazing and crops, is going to succumb to one final mega fire. This is going to lead to massive CO2 release, enough to cause another 0.3 degrees of warming. The Amazon is currently one of the largest living carbon reserves on the planet, up to 200 billion tonnes of it in the soils and the biomass. It's equivalent to a decade of humanity's fossil fuel emissions. And all of this affects our mental health. It affects our mental health now, from trauma, from extreme weather events, to loss of life, grief, loss of livelihoods, which can, and prolonged droughts cause, we're very well documented increases in mental illness in rural areas and increase in suicide. And we all have to witness the destruction of beautiful natural environments and heritage. And solastalgia is a beautiful word that means that you're missing the place that you love, that you're actually living in. You're watching it being destroyed in front of your eyes, basically. So climate grief and eco-anxiety, teenagers are already presenting to their GPs with these things in Australia. And the final result of all of this breakdown is poverty, conflict and war, and you know, with the inevitable consequences. In fact, I don't think even people in that situation don't even think about their mental health. They're just trying to survive. Coming to food, at 3 degrees, you basically lose subsistence farming across Africa and South Asia, and that's 1 billion people's livelihoods. So I've turned 2 pages. Just 1 minute. livestock won't survive either, the higher temperatures, and so you lose a vital source of protein. You get failed harvests, drastically reduced yields, and even very reliable food crops such as bananas and beans become unviable over very large areas of the globe. So without water, food or livestock, famine's going to be at unprecedented levels. Plant crops have heat thresholds too. For wheat, it's 34 degrees, corn 29, soy 32, and temperatures above that dramatically decrease crop yields. So in the US at 3 degrees, production of food crops is going to decline by half to 2/3. And all the best areas for growing grain crops are actually the same areas most affected by the summer heat. And in a population globally rising to 10 billion, you're going to have about half the food production by the time we're at 3 degrees. And of course, that's going to lead to mass starvation right across the globe. Food commodity price shocks are the next thing that happen, leading to increased poverty, political unrest, and conflict, as happened exactly with the beginning of the Syrian war. And Mike Linus in this book thinks that food shortage is actually going to be the trigger of large-scale civilizational collapse in a 3-degree world. So you've got failed states with millions fleeing from famine and war. And as we know from the Syrian refugee crisis, when you have a big influx of refugees, it polarizes politics, and there's been a big resurgence of far-right politics in Europe as a result of that. But instead of just one country, it's going to be whole regions or continents falling into chaos, first Africa, then South and West Asia, and the Americas, and so on. There are tipping points at 3 degrees. The loss of the Amazon is something that I've already described. In a 3-degree world, 12 out of 15 million square kilometres of permafrost that currently still exist are going to melt. That releases 100 billion tonnes of carbon by 2100 and more after that. And much is released as methane, which over a 20-year time span is 86 times more potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. Massive methane plumes have already been found above and north of Siberia. Arctic permafrost is currently collapsing much faster than expected. Rather than gradual, the melt can be sudden, and this is already happening. Forested areas are just liquefying and disappearing in Alaska, causing landslides, causing flat terrain to collapse into troughs and ponds. Observed maximum thaw depths are already exceeding those projected to occur by 2090, say scientists working on Arctic Canadian islands, 70 years and 2 degrees too early. Instead of 0.2 degrees warming from permafrost melt, which was predicted in 2015, we're now looking at 0.4 degrees or more by the end of this century, just from permafrost. Soon, also, by mid-century, summertime Antarctic ice cover will be absent. And that'll be the third globally significant ecosystem to collapse after the coral reefs and the Amazon rainforest. Increased heat will be captured by the dark oceans and no longer reflected back into space by the albedo effect. Observed rates of loss of sea ice are already double those predicted. Ice-free conditions could come earlier and last longer. The extra energy absorbed by the planet from the dark oceans, along with the loss of the Amazon and the permafrost, would take global heating right beyond humanity's control. And so unless. That's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Helen, for sharing that quite insightful and sobering presentation around a world at 3 degrees. I'm sure that there are many questions and reflections that we'd like to share from the audience, but we're going to move now straight into David's presentation. and there'll be an opportunity for questions and reflections after David has spoken. So David, can I please invite you to share your screen now and share your perspective, which of course is an optimist perspective on a world at 2100. Oh, I believe you're still on mute, David.
Okay, now we're right, share screen. Sorry about this, yeah. And go back to play. So, welcome everybody, and thank you, Luke, for the introduction earlier on. I suppose, like me, you're very depressed after hearing Helen talk about, the pessimistic view of 3 degrees. And I thought in presenting this, I started off looking at technologies and talking to engineers, I suppose, technology is what we love, sort of thing. So I got into it and thought, no, technology already exists. We don't have to tell engineers what technology is needed. So I started redoing it around sort of looking at the choices we have. And we have a choice. Either we continue with business as usual, or we accept what the world's earth scientists are telling us and treat the situation as an emergency, which is what it is. And of course, if you don't, well, this tortoise will be gone along with all of us. So 3 degrees to my thinking, and what Helen has sort of hinted at, is an area, it's a zone where civilization will collapse. And therefore I really worry about it. So I'm going to talk to engineers about their professional engineering code of ethics. And I wonder sometimes when I'm talking to students whether they actually have read the code of ethics of our institution of engineers. It requires us to demonstrate integrity, act on the basis of a well-informed conscience. I mean well-informed in finding out what your work is doing to nature and doing to society. We're required to be honest and trustworthy. And I'd say there that engineers have got to tell the truth. And I mean, tell the truth to your boss, tell the truth to the board of directors, tell the community what's going on, and respect the dignity of all persons. We need to practice competently, maintain and develop your knowledge and skills, not just of the technical competence that you enjoy, but also those other skills that you need when you're putting a project together, like the impacts on society and on nature. Represent your area of competence objectively. And one of the problems I see too often is your competence becomes sort of disrupted by some belief or ideology. And you use that ideology or belief to somehow distort your competence and the decisions you make. Always act on the basis of adequate knowledge and keep expanding your knowledge. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how we must assume leadership, uphold the reputation and trustworthiness of our profession. It's very important, as I said earlier, that you tell the truth and that you can be trusted. Support diversity. If we had a lot more women practicing engineering, I'm sure we'd have a different world than we do at the moment. It's only out in practice, there's only about 8 to 12% women in our profession. The universities have much higher percentages, but when they go out and work, they tend to drift off and have families and so on. Make reasonable efforts to communicate honestly and effectively to all your stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I do mean your boss. And if you, in your project, find that the impacts will be horrendous in some area, document it. Make sure that you keep a record of what you see as the worry, the danger of something, and get that to the board of directors so that they know in their fiduciary responsibility that the project you're working on may have adverse impacts on society and nature. And of course, promoting sustainability. Engage with the community responsibly and with your stakeholders. Practice engineering to foster the health, safety, and well-being of the community and of the environment. And that very much includes nature. And too often we tend to push nature out of the way for our development. And I talk to the students that I work with and say, go onto that site as it is now and measure the ecosystem services existing on that site. And when you design what's going to be replaced on that site, I want you to bring all those ecosystem services back into your project. So think about designing things into your building or whatever the project is that brings nature back into the site. So, nesting birds in your building sort of thing. Don't shun the birds because they poo on the ceiling or gutters or whatever. and balance the needs of the present with the needs of the future generations. I don't like the word balance so much because it says if we're doing really good things now, then the future might have to suffer because we enjoyed it. I would rather say that you have to protect the environment for future generations so that it is at least equal to or better than the one we're enjoying now. So you might say, where does climate change fit into all this ethics stuff? Well, I'm going to now talk about some of the things people are saying. David Hall is a researcher at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. He talks about denial. At its heart, climate denial is a conflict between fact and values. People who deny climate change, because to them it just feels wrong. The facts of climate change are in conflict with people's existing beliefs or ideologies and values. So they find reasons to sort of not accept the facts. This is known as motivated reasoning. It's irrational, and it sort of relates to cognitive dissonance that goes on in their brain, if you like. A good friend of mine, Ian Dunlop, who is a chemical engineer, said on the impacts of climate change, the Australian government has nothing to say. And he says this is a total abrogation of its first responsibility to protect the citizens of the country. And it's a massive failure of leadership and imagination. Ian goes on to say that zero emissions, even in a decade's time, coupled with large-scale drawdown of CO2 out of the atmosphere, will not be sufficient to negate the existential threat of climate change. And I brought Tina in as a brighter note. Tina is the sustainability chair of Scott Carver Architects. And she says, we cannot afford to live in ignorance. The unthinkable can and now does happen. And on a more positive note, Tina goes on and says, it is now clear that massive change is possible and we need to listen to the science. And I'm going to go on and argue now that we must make that massive change. Tim Flannery, most of you will know, the Weathermakers author. Tim is chair of the Climate Council. And a couple of years ago, Tim famously said that no report or warning or political agreement, no technological innovation has altered the ever upward trajectory of the CO2 and greenhouse gas pollution. And this simple fact forced Tim to say quite vocally that his 20 years of climate activism has been a colossal failure. And I went on to say, after being in Copenhagen with Tim, that I believe it's been a spectacular failure. We haven't changed the trajectory of politicians or anything in terms of addressing the climate crisis. And the reason, of course, we well know is this. Don't be afraid, don't be scared, it's cold, it won't hurt you. And he's showing it to that funny man there that's now a Deputy Prime Minister as of a couple of days ago. That's the sort of real issue that we are facing. But for me, this passion of mine is driven by this beautiful granddaughter of mine. That's her at 1 week old. And she looked up at me and said, is this CO2 thing really serious, Grandpa? That was when she was 1 week old. She's now 12, growing into a beautiful young woman and is very active. I was thrilled when she went and bought a Stop Adani Extinction Rebellion t-shirt and wore it with me on a day of protest in Canberra. It's fantastic. And that's the passion. That's the reason for my passion. So why do I have hope? Why do I have hope that we will avoid the things that Helen was talking about? Well, because I'm a chartered professional engineer, and we engineers have the privilege, if you like, of being able to solve this. Engineers have developed all the solutions. It's just that they're not being implemented at the moment. And because I have two beautiful granddaughters who are relying on me to fix this threat for their future, because I know that the technology for the solutions currently exists. We don't have to go, as our Prime Minister is saying, and have a technology roadmap about future technologies that he doesn't know even exist, and that's they're going to save us. And because I have faith in human integrity, ingenuity, and in nature, you know, nature restores and helps itself. This Gaia, the living planet, is a self-healing species, if you like. And if we destroy it, it'll always be here, and nature will resume and take over and repair the damage. And I believe there are good things happening right now. You know, you can see lots of things happening in terms of the photovoltaics rolling out across Australia on rooftops. Fantastic, lead the world in that. And because politicians, after all, can be booted out of office. But are we moving fast enough? I believe we're not moving anywhere near as fast as we should. We have to vastly ramp up our activism. and our demands for governments to take the existential threat of climate change damn seriously, and biodiversity loss, which we haven't touched on much, although Helen did talk about it. We've responded before to existential threats globally with pandemics, world wars, nuclear weapons proliferation, and of course we solved the ozone problem with the Montreal Protocol, where the world got together and said we can't put these gases into the atmosphere that are going to destroy the ozone layer. And locally, of course, we've responded to massive natural disasters, tsunamis and earthquakes. We can do this. It's mobilizing the people. And that's why I say we've got to get active, through things that you can do. Can we respond again to the climate change the way we have in the past? And I get warned not to use warlike footings because people don't like war. So David, don't say emergency and we have to act in a warlike footing because people will turn off. I'm not sure that, they need to know this. The other reason that I'm very optimistic, and I put pessimism aside, although I do go into despair occasionally, because the tools and the technologies are now available. And this is where I was going to go into a fair bit of techno speak, and I thought, no, you can find this anywhere else. And what I'll list is a list of the references related to each of these. But just quickly, we all know renewable energy is going, our solar rooftops are fantastic, and the prices of these are dropping so fast at the moment that they're going to place it. And don't be fooled by people saying, oh, they can't supply base load. Because the work I did at BZE with the incredible team down there, they proved that you can meet the demands of base load with solar, wind, geothermal, and battery storage. Now, this is energy storage. It's not just batteries. You can have pumped hydro, which is a storage of using gravity to generate overnight, pump it up during the day when you've got solar to pump it up. But we must do this with smart metering, and smart meters now exist, but they tend to exist in homes only. What we need is smart metering that starts to balance the demands elsewhere with the renewable energy generation, and that's coming. And then there are lots of tools that you can use. You've got the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. You can look at your project and go through each of those goals and say, does this project satisfy this goal? And there are rating schemes. I'll talk a little bit about rating schemes in a minute. This is the Green Star for buildings and the IS scheme for infrastructure, which I was involved in very early on. And then there are things like the Planetary Boundaries, and this is been developed by Will Steffen in Australia with Johan Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. It shows the sort of physical boundaries that they worked out and where we are starting to exceed the safe zone, certainly in the biodiversity area, land conversion or land we're exceeding it there, and climate change, we've exceeded it. Circular economy, I could spend a lot of time explaining circular economy, but that is where you don't dig stuff out of the ground, put it through the economy, and then put it in landfill, which is how you measure the GDP, just by the way. And I could spend a long time talking about marginal abatement cost curves, where you can actually put down the savings of an initiative in your project, and you add up those savings, and you can say to the boss, over time, this is what we can save, and here's the greenhouse abatement that we can achieve. These are going to cost, but if we save this, we might be able to do this one as well, which might have a benefit for the community. So in my references, I'll put sort of directions to these where you can go and read a hell of a lot more. And all around the world, there are these rating tools. But I want to just focus for a minute on this diagram, which I use with the master's program that I was running at Southern Cross University. What it shows is nature along the horizontal axis and sort of the sphere in which you're working on the vertical axis. And previously you had indiscriminate resource use. You just pulled stuff out of the ground, put it into use, and then put it into landfill. Then we started getting efficient. We engineers intervened and said, hey, we can be more efficient with this. Then we started saying, hey, we've got to conserve these because they'll run out eventually. And we will move then, and we're starting to do this, into affiliating with nature. At the moment, we're saying, we just get rid of nature for our progress and progress. I love that term, progress. Destroy nature and build a house there. But we need to start mimicking. I'm going to talk about biomimicry in a minute. Then we need to restore the lost nature from this work here. We need to nurture nature. And then, of course, we become nature. We are part. We've got to live within nature. And this just shows the sphere going up from more microorganisms through our homes, right up to the whole Gaia, the planet, and where you move into regenerative development. So we move from degenerative to regenerative development, and engineers can do it. You need to spend a little bit of time there. The green rating systems, of course, at the moment have pulled us out of this area down here and moving us up to that, but they're still in a negative impact area. We need to change that. Biomimicry is amazing. Does that kingfisher mean something to you? Have you seen the fast trains in Japan? They have a nose just like that. You know, nature devises an amazing strength through the way it builds things. And of course, spiders have developed a material that in a cross section is stronger than steel. The gecko, you all know geckos running around your walls and up across the ceiling. It can hang on the wall upside down or on the roof, the ceiling, because in their feet are millions of little hairs, and the van der Waals force between the end of that hair and where they're touching attracts them such that every hair on those feet holds their weight. This is biomimicry. There's the wing of the Dreamliner of the 787. Does it look very familiar to this bird? And look at the shark compared with the 787. All this streamlining of the shark is replicated here for efficiency of flying in an aeroplane. Now, we can do this in our buildings, and we just need to mimic the ants. I'm not going to read through all this, but what happens with the ants is that they have cool chambers down here where the air is cooled, and then these buttresses warm in the sun, and the air is drawn up through their burrows and exhaled out the top, and it's sucked in through holes around the bottom into the cool chambers. We can do that with buildings where you might have heat generated in the offices, it spills out into the atrium and it's sucked up, and you have exhaust fans up there to get rid of the heat that way. So we are doing it, but nowhere near enough. This is a way that you need to read this separately yourselves and consider how we can move from traditional engineering into engineering that delivers sustainability outcomes. And I like that term, sustainability outcomes, rather than sustainable outcomes, because sustainable just means keeping going as you are. And I won't read through all of those things, but things like focus on the technical issues, that's what engineers tend to do. We need to move into focusing on social, environmental, as well as economic, synergistically, bring them all together and bring those experts into your project team. So think about that when you go back and have a look at this. Very important. Using all of these tools and technologies, could we create a safe climate and a supporting environment for life as we know it to continue? Yes, I believe we can, but without significant change. We have to make a change. And this is you've probably all seen this quote from Albert Einstein: you cannot solve a problem using the same mindset that created that problem. So we need to change the mindsets of what how we govern ourselves, the economy that we use. And these are big tasks. So here are my takeaways for you regarding my talk. I want you to commit to making a difference. When you graduate, the engineers that are at university now, commit to change things, make a difference. Commit to adhering to the code of ethics. Tell the truth. Don't let the boss say, no, you've got to do that. I don't care about that. You know, tell the boss that that's wrong. Consider the impacts of nature and society on everything you do. Don't just think an environmental impact statement gets you away. It doesn't. Listen to the experts on climate. I have a lot of engineers say to me, I'm an engineer. I know more about the climate than those scientists do. And if you don't know, bring in an expert, for heaven's sake, to assist you. Keep up to date with the professional development right throughout your life. Don't think, oh, I've graduated now, I know everything, I don't need to know anymore. You will, all through your career, need to understand how critical ecosystem services are to life on Earth and protect them with everything you do. Join me in getting active. You know, I've become a rebel. I've been working on Extinction Rebellion protests, but my work in BZE and Australian Conservation Foundation, I do a lot of work to try and stop that horrendous mine in central Queensland. And there are lots of others. The CANA is the sort of Climate Action Now Australia, and that's all over Australia. There are CANA groups. And think before you vote. That's critical. Don't just vote because Dad said I had to vote this way. And sign on to Australian Engineers Declare. We now have about 2,000 plus engineers that have committed to declaring a climate emergency. And I think it's a couple of hundred companies have signed on to it now. This is what I see 2100 will look like. These are the buildings. This building already exists in Sydney. And look at the greenery on that building. It's fantastic. It cools the building and it turns CO2 and exhausts oxygen. Amazing. These things can happen. We've got to make sure they happen. Wouldn't you like to work in an office like this? I've been in there. It is the first class lounge at Qantas, International Qantas. I luckily got an upgrade once and went in there. The guy that worked there said it's just magic. He loves going to work. With renewable energy, here is the example I love showing. These are 3 solar towers, Ivanpah in the Mojave Desert in the US. That that triple system there produces 375 megawatts of electricity 24/7, continuous, by heating, melting salt up there, focusing the sun's rays onto it. And they store the molten salt down there for nighttime generation of steam that drives a turbine. That is fantastic. And it's about 1,000 gigawatt hours of electricity per year it puts into the grid in the US. So by 2199, I was thinking, if we have survived and if we desire a long future for life on the planet, we should be living as part of nature, in total harmony with nature, be living within local community systems where GDP is not measured, be running our businesses, however you define business, where purpose, not profit, drives their activity, be measuring true societal happiness, health and security and connectedness. That means moving away from GDP, of course. Have long forgotten that we ever burn fossil fuels for our energy supply and transport. We've stabilized the atmospheric greenhouse gases at a scientifically determined safe concentration, parts per million. We've abandoned digital dependence for our self-gratification. We know our local community by name and we meet them regularly. I like this one. We have no further need for lawyers. And we have long ago recognized that engineers have led the creation of a safe, clean, healthy environment where love and happiness flourishes and no one is obscenely seeking financial wealth. So that's how I see the end of this century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm just looking around at some of the image tiles on my screen and seeing a lot of applause whilst people are on mute. So thank you. And also extending that thanks again to Helen to setting you up to deliver that hopeful message as well, obviously. So now we are going to open the floor to some questions. So there's a couple of ways that questions can be put to the floor. Probably the easiest and most efficient way with a group of this size is to pop any questions into the chat window, and I can monitor those in just over to my left. That's where I'm looking now. But I also had my own questions that I thought I would share just to kind of get started with. And I guess this question is for both David and Helen to respond to. Is there anything that you would like to expand upon from what the other speaker has presented? So David, do you have any further reflections on what Helen has shared, and Helen likewise?
No, I just agree absolutely with Helen's take. In fact, I think some of the things that Helen's saying have got me more depressed than I was before I started, because this situation is a climate emergency and a biodiversity loss emergency. I think that we accept that. It's frightening, and I have to sort of caution myself not to tell my grandchildren just how frightening it is, but I use that sort of optimistic approach with them. And that excites them. Oh, thank you, Grandpa, they say, which is wonderful.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, it is frightening. And I, just reflection on my own talk, this preparation really took me into an area that I haven't gone into before in terms of, not only thinking about the current health impacts, which is what I mostly talk about, because people don't understand them at all and don't recognize them, but actually projecting that forward to 3 degrees has been incredibly enlightening, and in equal parts sobering. And I think what it has done is focus my mind on more on just how big a thing we've got to turn around here, and how little time we have to do that. And in terms of David's presentation, I loved it so much, and all those incredible things that engineers can do that doctors can't do. Oh, I'm so jealous. And I love some of those pictures on the, moving to regenerative, in everything that we do, working with nature instead of against it. So I love all that. And I think, we have all the tools. We actually have all the tools that we need right now, and more will, if we bend our minds to it, if we fund the researchers that we've got in Australia, our incredible powerhouse of everything that we do here, then more solutions will come to us as we go. I agree that the biggest problem is the political roadblock that we have at the moment with our federal government, which does not exist in state Liberal governments or coalition governments. We've got Andrew Constance talking about, this is the Transport Minister of New South Wales, talking about his experience losing his house in the bushfires, talking about, you know, New South Wales has now got the best EV policy anywhere in Australia.
True.
So there's just so many people doing such good things, and we've got this kind of this massive constipation in Canberra that, you know, I don't know, I wish I had an enema big enough for it, really. Anyway, so yeah, that's all.
Just from my perspective, our magazine, the Create magazine of Engineers Australia, if you open that up, you see lots of research going on that excites me, of things that are coming up, and that, you know, they're not commercialized yet, but when you sort of look at it and how it might be used in giving us a long future, not a short future, which we're headed for now, that excites me, because it's, you know, it's we engineers that can do these things based around science. I'm not degrading scientists at all.
Wonderful. And there's a comment there that that in the chat that your enema analogy was the quote of the webinar so far, Helen. So we'll send your prize in the mail. There's 3 questions that have come through on the chat so far, so I'm going to flick over to those now. The first was, you know, around the tech that's already available, and I guess the question sums down to what is holding us back. There's been a willingness to adopt new technologies in the past, such as, you know, with petrol, digital, in the military sphere. What is so different about this techno step that prevents us from taking it, in terms of that step towards a more sustainable, renewable energy source?
I don't think there are any technical blockages. The blockages are behavioural, and they're certainly political. I just noticed that in the chat, someone has said that earlier on, I said that politics and legislation have failed us. They haven't done the change that we need. But later on, I was talking about activism. Well, I've studied the work that Roger Hallam and the other woman that founded Extinction Rebellion, and they based their work on work by a researcher over there who looked at revolutions in the past. And what they're saying from their research is that if you can get 3.5% of the voting population active on the streets, demanding change, and that backed up on that, you've got the silent 30% of the people saying, yes, we agree with what they're saying, that will force a change to government. And what they're saying is that in revolutions in the past, that's all that you needed to change things. The French Revolution, of course, chopped a few heads off as well, but I'm not recommending we do anything like that.
I think, David, this is actually a great point, if I can just interject to touch on another question that people have, because a question from Sarah Ann Fry is in the chat window if you want to read it in full. So earlier you mentioned that you know, politics and legislation have done little to rectify the issue, but you encourage us to take part in activism and demand that our governments address the issue. Can you reconcile those two statements?
Well, the fact is, I don't think we've had the activism that we're now seeing with the student strike for climate. We're now seeing XR is having demonstrations in Brisbane almost daily now. You can go past a bank and they're standing out there with the big XR symbols and saying, this bank has got to stop funding Adani, things like that. I mean, they weren't there 20 years ago. The last time we were in the streets demonstrating in that sort of environment was the Vietnam War, where there were large demonstrations of people, and that got to close to the 3%. And what happened in the end, particularly in the US, they pulled out of the Vietnam War. I was in Hanoi once and I was saying, you've got to realize I was in the Royal Australian Air Force during the Vietnam War, and this little hand went up at the back and said, excuse me, Mr. David, we don't call it the Vietnam War here, we call it the American War. You know, so that's demonstrators acting and achieving results. So I think we can do it. That's why I say, you know, don't sit silently and just do the project any way that the boss tells you. I'll probably have a lot of bosses ringing me up now, but you've got to tell the boss the truth. You know? So I don't find that a problem. That we weren't doing it 20 years ago, and politics just went on their merry way, doing whatever their donors said. You don't do this, we won't donate.
Yeah, so that sort of relates to that earlier question as well. You know, we've got the technical fixes, so why aren't we doing it? Well, the key thing is vested interests, the fossil fuel interests and the lobbying and the political donations that they give to both major parties are major things that basically undermine our democracy, and those interests are very powerful and they're persuasive and they control massive media outlets like the Murdoch press. And so when you put all that together and you add the revolving door that occurs between jobs in the fossil fuel industry and jobs in Canberra in Parliament House, you have the perfect storm, because public opinion has been basically well over half for, you know, increasing climate action for quite a while now. And the latest figures is like 62% or 64% or something, like want much more action. And so we've sort of won. I think we've got enough of the public. We've got some structures though that are massively skewing the playing field towards the fossil fuel interests. So of course they're not going to go without a fight. We've got to, it's like Gandhi said, first they laugh at you, then first they ignore you, sorry, then they laugh at you, then they fight you. Okay, that's where we are now, and then we win. Okay, but
they join you in the end.
Yeah, but there's a reason. I mean, David's right, we are seeing more protests, but we're also seeing a lot more legislation, state and federal, to suppress protest. Okay, there's a whole lot of laws that have come into play, and I've certainly experienced that here in Sydney. We're going to divestment actions at banks and things like that, that you're not allowed to stand under the canopy, you know, because that's the bank's territory. You're not allowed to stand in the shopping centre. You know, the security guards will come and move you on. So they've increased the laws against protest because there is more protest. So it is happening. It does need to continue to happen, and it needs to escalate.
Yeah, you're so true, Helen. I just use the term democracy's been hacked, totally hacked.
So we've had, obviously the discussion has sparked a large number of questions, and we've had another kind of half a dozen or so come in. But I'm also conscious that a part of this webinar and workshop is that we're going to move into some breakout rooms to continue this discussion in the context of, smaller groups and with a set exercise. So I'm assuming, David and Helen, that you're okay with this.
Yeah.
I might collect all these questions, send them to you for some text answers, and we'll include that in the post-event wrap. Would that be okay?
Right, that's fine, yeah.
Yeah, because there's some really great ones in there. One that I'm particularly interested in is around transition, which is how do we bring miners / old tech on board? Yeah. Things about EA and the gas-led recovery. So there's some interesting issues that would be great to explore further.
Absolutely.
But as I alluded to at the top of this call, and as I've just mentioned now, we're going to invite everyone to move into some breakout rooms. So I've already assigned them, and you should automatically disperse there momentarily when I click the magic button. But what we're going to be doing in these breakout rooms, for those of you that are able to stay with us and participate, is we're going to be contemplating 3 degrees ourselves. So what we're going to be doing is working through a vision change action process. So there'll be about 20 or so minutes to do this, which is a bit tight. So we encourage everyone that's sharing in that forum to be, try to be brief and considerate of the time frames. But as a group in each of the breakouts, you're going to be coming to a vision statement of your own for 2100. And so like an example that I've put in there is, by 2100, the world will be environmentally, economically, socially sustainable and ethical. So this is something of a utopian perspective on what 2100 can hold. The next element of this exercise is to think about what needs to change. We're going to be thinking on 4 major shifts or changes that need to happen. So they could be social, political. It could be that you just need your neighbor, Bob, to start putting his bins out on time rather than rushing in the morning and waking you up. It can be small or large. And then the final stage of the workshop is to talk about actions. What actions can you take? What actions will you take? Tangible things that you can do, which will help that vision be achieved. So David is going to be in one of the groups. My colleagues Alison and Melanie from EWB will be in a group each, and I'll also be in a group. Helen, were you able to stay in the end?
No, I'm not going to be able to, Luke. I'm going to have to dive out in about 10 minutes, but just stick me somewhere momentarily so I can at least listen while I'm having my lunch. Would be really nice. And then I'm going to have to shoot off. But thank you anyway. It's been great.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, as I said, Alison, Melanie, myself and David will be in each of the breakout rooms to support this process. But we're really hopeful that this can be led by you, the participants, those that are able to stay on. So I'm about to click to send you all out to the breakout rooms, and we look forward to continuing the discussion there and then reconvening back in the main room in about 20 minutes. Okay, welcome back everyone. Now, before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge how brief a period of time that was to cover some really interesting conversations and to raise some really interesting points with one another. So thank you for throwing yourselves into that challenge. And I've been in the background just having a look at some of the visions, changes and actions that each breakout room was working on. It was really great to see some really reflective thoughts come out of that conversation. So before we close the event, I think it would be really wonderful to have each group hear from one another to hear essentially what that 10 to 15 minutes of conversation resulted in. And so I'm not sure if your kind of group leaders and Alison, Melanie or David prepared you for this, but we're hoping that someone would be comfortable from each group stepping forward and just sharing, loosely what that vision was that was in the group, and what the changes were that needed to happen, and then of course the actions that the group was looking to work towards. So we're going to keep it pretty traditional and just ask the breakout room one perhaps to come forward with that. Would someone from breakout room one like to share?
Oh, and I have to now admit that we just got dragged into talking, and so I didn't actually ask for a nomination. And so is there anyone that does want to put their hand up from breakout room one? Because we had some great contributions, and the post-it notes are available there as a reference. Anyone keen? Always a tricky ask.
I can try.
Wait, there we go.
So a lot of our changes at the start were sort of talking more about foundational changes, sort of getting the government on board and sort of how that would sort of look. And a lot of it was sort of around sort of activism, getting sort of people more involved and sort of caring a bit more, and being willing to take sort of action a bit more on what they believe would be the right thing for the future. Sort of having a bit more mentorship. So I think it was Sarah said that they had a very good mentor when they were learning in engineering, and sort of that made a big influence on them. Sort of influencing shareholders, because they have quite a big voice in influencing business and therefore government in what they will need to do. A lot of our changes came from inspirational leaders wanting sort of a driving force that will guide us in our future, ensuring our basic needs will be continuing to be met. A lot of this was sort of job focused, so making sure that people in the future have jobs that they can sort of transition into. Say if a power plant is being shut down, people that work there still need to have a way to feed their family and continue on in their day-to-day. So sort of trying to help them segue into something else, whether that is going from being at a coal farm to a solar farm or something different. Making sure individual values are driving decision making. And then in the end, our vision is sort of that all of our communities will be connected and a world that will be more equal and has systematically changed from recognizing the environmental imperatives to do so. Having greater unity and community, having that ability to sort of know your neighbor really well, and having sort of more of a down-to-earth community to help sort of balance everything out. Shifting the economic thinking, sort of going more with that donut economics theory, having shared environmental priorities, having a world that looks different, as we saw in the presentation by David, having that much greener sort of environment to live in, covering them, having that much nicer sort of environment to thrive in, and having that voice of the younger generation being more involved. I was sort of mentioned that young people have a much bigger influence than people sort of give them credit for, and have a lot of power, and sort of making sure that they know these things and they can get excited about sort of helping to convey that to the older generation and get them maybe more motivated to make change as well.
Wonderful, thank you for that group and those reflections, Lachlan. We might jump to your group, Mel, and then finish with group 2.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you know, time was short, but we've contributed on the mural board quite enthusiastically. So really our most popular post-it was quite simple, quite high level, and it was about just living in harmony with nature, living in a sustainable way alongside the natural world. Then in terms of what needed to shift, quite a lot of enthusiasm around in the political realm. So we need to get money out of politics. We need to hold politicians to account. So you lie and you go down. We also think that there's space to be encouraging fossil fuel companies to shift over to renewables, of course, and a big role for civil activism. In terms of very concrete actions, education gets some big tips from us, and making renewable energy more accessible. So energy equity, it's such a no-brainer. It's not just for the rich, obviously, and a bit of work to do with those fossil fuel companies. So that's us in a snapshot.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thanks, Mel. A great snapshot, and thank you for innovating with the addition of ticks. That's definitely an oversight in not having a voting mechanism for all of the groups. David, your breakout.
Thanks, Luke. I'm going to share my screen because our team couldn't click on the link, so I brought up a share screen, so I'll do that again. And we unanimously elected Gavin as our spokesperson. Yeah. So I'll just share the screen again.
Okay, spell.
There.
Thanks,
Now,
David.
Can you read that, Gav?
Maybe you can read a little bit larger, would be great. Thank you. So David showed true leadership there and said, Gavin, you're doing this. So yeah, happy to do that. We had a great group discussion. In fact, we were so focused on the vision there, and you can see some visions there about really thinking a way into the future rather than just thinking short term into the future. And also part of the vision is about when we are at 2100, being able to look back and say, actually, 50 years ago, we'd already implemented that. So it's trying to accelerate the pace of change. Starting to be able to nail really that. You can see one down here. It says we have changed our governance system so that vested interests no longer influence politics. The one right down the bottom there. Or maybe the vested interest could well be the vested interest that is dealing with the climate emergency. So flipping it so that it's there is a lot of focus on the importance matters rather than ignoring them. There's talk about empathy and talking about working with the environment. So very similar to, say, Mel's group there, thinking holistically. We then moved straight over to actions because we got so engrossed in visions and holy smokes, 5 minutes left, time to take some action. And we kind of divided that up into some, what can I do at a sort of individual scale, right through from buying green electricity, right through to another one here about influencing engineering organisations to declare a climate emergency. So that way we are thinking about, well, what can I do at an individual scale? What can we do at an organisational scale to be able to really bring this to the fore and take some specific action? An example of an action that one of the participants said was, "I'll no longer be using fossil fuel." And so if everybody was doing that, or if the majority of people were doing that, suddenly it's making a huge difference. So there's both the element of the collective individual action, as well as looking at holistically at some organisational or even government levels about what we do together. Great job, team.
Wonderful, thank you. So look, we've gone a few minutes over the time that we had set for today's webinar, but I do want to thank you all for staying on board for those breakout rooms and that discussion, and for, even though it was such a brief time, for sharing your thoughts in that process. I want to again extend my thanks to Helen, who's already departed, but also to David for presenting in the first part of this webinar. It was really appreciated to get your reflections on, what is feeling like a very distant thing in the future, but is simply a lifespan of someone born today, around 80 or so years in the future. So it is very far, but very close. In wrapping the event, I'd like to remind people that we'll be posting a recording and sending through some resources and links to the presentations that David and Helen shared, and also capturing the questions that were asked during the Q&A and having those answered as well. I'm going to stay on the line as everyone departs. So if you do have any kind of questions or would like to stay and continue the discussion in any way, you're more than welcome to do so. But I now declare this webinar uplifting, hopeful, and finished. So thank you so much for joining us today.